So let's see how I can explain this in a way that everyone can understand me, because this is the most challenging part. And we lawyers really rarely stop thinking about how generalized our concepts are and that other people just do not get them. So I'll try to explain it as easy as possible and also maybe explain it to myself a little bit. So, business and human rights. You know, a lot of lawyers, including my colleagues that I have talked to, look at me like pretty weirdly when I mention the term business and human rights. And granted, it doesn't sound so scary and serious as tort law or insurance law, tax law, the last one, pretty scary indeed. But nevertheless, business and human rights is nothing new. I always like to say that law is like a living, breathing instrument, like a tool that needs to serve the realities of the social development. And business and human rights is a very fine example that do exactly this. And it is probably fair to say that the development of the field started in the 70s, so it's not so new now, with the UN General Assembly that adopted this declaration on establishment of a new international economic order and accompanying program. And they were talking about they were talking about regulation and control of the activities of transnational corporations. And actually, it's quite interesting that the motive behind this was the revelation that US company, I think it was called ITT, so they had conspired with CIA to interfere in the international political leadership of Chile. That was in the 1972. So by this point, it became clear that companies with sufficient funds and resources can influence much more easily a more and more connected world. Okay, so why didn't we just regulate the companies? Well, you know, I like this song, Price Tag by Jessie J. So she sings that it's not about the money, but in this case, it actually is. Plus a little bit more principal questions like freedom of establishment and the policy trend that in international relations, the hard law was steadily avoided in favor of soft law. So things continued business as usual until early 2000s, when some efforts were made to amend the situation with the draft norms of responsibility of transnational corporation and other business enterprises with regard to human rights, which were rejected actually, so they have no legal value. But by that time, some companies started to self-regulate. And that was due to some, I would say, rather unfortunate incidents and utterly disgusting practices like sweatshops and modern slavery in a way. And public attention was focused on these companies. I think that maybe Nike was the most prominent case that was actually, it was discovered that they were having these sweatshops in Indonesia, and they were using practical slave labor there. So basically, because of the huge impact that these revelations and the public attention, especially in the Western world, put the pressure on these companies, they started to self-regulate. And of course, that gave the needed push. Because self-regulation obviously is not the best option for the state, efforts were made in international level, and eventually the guiding principles of business and human rights were adopted. So basically, that's something that you probably heard me talking a lot about, the guiding principles of business and human rights. And they're pretty simple, actually. The idea is pretty simple behind it. And they're built on these three pillars. It's also in our environment is called like the protect, respect, and remedy framework. And so now, of course, the guiding principles are not mandatory, but they were envisioned as a starting point and a standard. And considering the recent years and the development on UN level, they are adopting this binding treaty on business and human rights. On EU level, we have the upcoming corporate accountability directive. And on national level, we have more and more initiatives. I think the latest one is the German mandatory human rights due diligence law. So it's still just a draft, but I believe that it was going to be adopted by the end of the year. So these guiding principles, they're in the core of the business and human rights framework. And okay, what is the liability here? So what is the liability point of view? And it's pretty simple. So basically, what we have is the state that has the responsibility to protect and obviously can be held liable on that. So they adopt legislation that make companies obliged to respect human rights, so they can be liable to the victims of potential human rights abuses and to the state, because often they have administrative sanction or even criminal sanction, depends on the, of course, on the concrete case. So establishing a transparent network of liable nodes in the value chain is essential. And this is about the transparency that we heard both Teresa and Orion talking about. So establishing this transparent network in the value chain with the purpose of identifying, seizing, mitigating, and remediating adverse impact of human rights, with a specific attention to prevention, is something that we considered as the core intersection between business and human rights and liability. So basically, this is what I called it, defining it through liability. So in practice, what business and human rights aims to achieve is that a certain company that produces, for example, let's say t-shirts, because this is like one of the most prominent example, typical case. So these companies found and operate on the common market, do not commit any violations, but their contractors may be. And by contractors, I mean the people who are supplying, the companies that are supplying clothes and the cotton, of course. And this is the danger of this supply chain that's not transparent. And there could be many different violations that can occur in this very simplified supply chain that I just described. And if they do, if according to the third pillar, we have the right remedy, we already heard Orion and Teresa explaining how difficult it is going to be to actually prove this causation. And here we're talking about something that has been around for years and that has been proven that cause human rights violations over and over again. And even in this oversimplified example, the liability network that I talked about looks like a big mess from the legal point of view. And do have in mind, whatever links there are between violations and damages, they need to be proven. The more nodes in the network, the harder it gets. And here we are talking only about traditional products and raw materials. And what happens, however, when you put the digital component on top of it for the product and for the process of the production, which is basically in the core of the new industrial approach that is being developed all around the world, well, what happens is that now I know that in the recent few months, okay, so it has been talked about Industry 5.0, but I suggest to slow down a little bit here and see how an already complicated situation can become even more complicated. So in Industry 4.0, I think it's best characterized by the European Commission. So they describe it as fostering strong customization of products under the condition of highly flexible production, introduction of methods of self-optimization, self-configuration, self-diagnosis, cognition, and intelligent support of workers in their increased complex work. So yeah, this is very comprehensive definition, but actually Industry 4.0 is related to four main trends in manufacturing: specialization, customization, distribution, and servitization, which trends determine the main features of Industry 4.0. So those are interoperability, visualization, decentralization, real-time decision-making, service orientation, and modularity. And you see this map of how Industry 4.0 is situated compared to the traditional Industry 3.0, let's call it. These features are enabled, among other things, by this distributed system of cyber-physical assets that we were looking at. It's SeCoIIA, and the so-called Internet of Things, of course. So to put it more simple term, Industry 4.0 is shaped by the introduction of ICT in the manufacturing processes, and its core In its core, it is a collective term which refers to ICT and the concepts for the organization of value chains which have profound implication of how manufacturing is organized in the so-called smart factories or factories of the future that I think we already discussed this a little bit. And the concept of smart factories or factories of the future reflects the idea of a new model of manufacturing based on dynamic assemblage of transformable networked factories and industrial assets which have adaptive learning capabilities and can optimize their performance with a high degree of autonomy. So you should know by now how much more complicated everything is when we talk about Industry 4.0. I think I demonstrated it a little bit. And business and human rights, not only when we talk about business and human rights in Industry 4.0, it's not only because of the liability allocation part, but also aside from the liability, the main function of business and human rights is to protect the rights before they are violated. So it's protection before remedy in a way. And contrary to what I have heard from some colleagues in the sector, it is important to hear what considerations and challenges companies have and face. In a lot of cases, human rights are violated because of lack of transparency, and we already saw that Orion and Teres, they talked about this transparency and the importance that it has. And in the supply chain, it is vital, I would say, and sometimes a sheer unawareness of on the side of the company is the case why human rights are violated. So obviously, this means that these cases need to be addressed, because at the end of the day, individuals would be the one winning by not being forced to live through some traumatic, potentially fatal experience. Nevertheless, the specific of Industry 4.0 I already elaborated on create a number of additional problems when we look at the goal at hand and one of its most prominent mediums, namely the supply chain transparency. So starting from the bottom, there already is a number of problems with raw materials, and especially in the context of EU's clear ambition to establish this strategic autonomy in key value chains, with problems that range from existence of trade barriers, for example, to the lack of choice of control over the raw material suppliers who are tier X in a very, very complex supply chain, and often do not offer any transparency on how exactly they extract these raw materials. And this is especially evident when we talk about critical raw materials, which are economically and strategically important for the European economy, but have a high risk associated with their supply. It is important to note that these materials are not classified as critical because they are little, that they are scarce, but rather because first of all, they have significant economic importance for key sectors in the European economy, such as consumer electronics, such as automotive, aerospace, defense and health, and also steel production. On the second part, second characteristic is that they have a high supply risk due to the very high import dependence and high level of concentration of set material in particular country, like China, for example. And they also, on the third characteristic is that they lack the lack of viable substitute. So basically, they have unique properties. So what we concluded in our research at SeCoIIA, however, is that in Industry 4.0, we have this shadow supply chain that supply data needed for the process and or for the manufactured product, depends what you're manufacturing, of course. And there we determined the existence of what we call digital raw materials. Now, I would say that data is the basic unit here. We are currently discussing if there are some other units, but I'm not going to go into details here. But now, of course, you're going to ask if there is such thing as critical digital raw materials. And I say that there could be. And again, using an analogy, I already said what are the three characteristics of critical raw materials. So we have, obviously, we have data that can be significant, that has significant economic importance for key sectors in the European economy, and especially because it's needed in certain quantities in order to be useful. They can have high supply risk, but it would be due to the nature of the data. For example, data about certain type of incidents may not be available very often, or the risk can come from a high probability of human rights violation. And this is also the case with the biometric data, which is also always, I would say, always presenting a high risk. So as for the lack of a viable substitute, it is usually possible to use synthetic data, but of course their utilization is limited. So yes, I would say that we can definitely talk about the emerging of critical digital raw materials. And that what actually brought us to this increased complexity of the supply chain that I demonstrated on the very basic level about the raw materials. So this complexity actually led us to designing this model that concerns the due diligence. So I mentioned that in the lowest tier supply chain, it doesn't get any less it's very complicated there. It doesn't get any less complicated, but due diligence has been the traditional instrument to address this complexity. And due diligence here, I mean the due diligence the way that the business and human rights framework understands it. So it's also the instrument that was used traditionally by companies to avoid liability claims before they arise. But traditional due diligence in the business and human rights sense is not entirely suitable for the needs of Industry 4.0 and smart manufacturing due to the changing role of the manufacturer. We already mentioned this, and also the customer and the digital raw materials. On the other hand, it has long been established that the content and the scope of human rights due diligence is determined by the context in which a company is operating, its activities and its business relationships. So that's why I actually find the idea of Teresa here about this technological unit really fascinating, because it's very much in accordance to what we found out going through an entirely separate way of thinking about this. And the guiding principles, they do not specify any modalities of a collaborative approach to human rights due diligence. The default position, therefore, remains that it is up to each company individually to discharge its corporate responsibility to respect human rights by conducting its own due diligence process. And the collaborative nature of Industry 4.0 requires equally collaborative approach in order to address the specific challenges. By collaborative human rights due diligence, we understand decentralized and joint action of actors operating on different tiers in a supply chain to collaboratively identify, prevent, mitigate risks in their business models and operations. So collaborative human rights due diligence is therefore a collective decentralized activities which can also involve different industries, are often subject to different jurisdictions, and that's one of the main problems that we face. And the main benefit of putting these human rights due diligence efforts in a particular, in the manufacturing industry, is that it could produce network effect, incentivizing business to collaborate, also on providing collective remedy. And so the first building block here refers to, by the way, you would just tell me about the time if I need to speed up. I guess I need to.
A little bit, yeah.
Yes, okay, so I got carried away, obviously. But the first building block basically refers to the obligations of the state. The second block concerns the supply chain due diligence. Essentially, this building block refers to mechanisms for ensuring end-to-end transparency of supply chain operators, especially in the context of Industry 4.0. And this building block should include mandatory supply chain due diligence obligations for conflict data, which may originate from conflict or high-risk areas. The third building block concerns sectorial collaborative human rights due diligence. It lies at the heart of the framework of collaborative human rights due diligence and has two elements which account respectively for the public and private aspects. I guess the fourth, is related to human rights based standardization, which actually I am very I never really thought so much about this from the perspective that Teresa gave us, so we are going to look to it once again and see how actually we can adapt our approach there, because I think we were heading in a different direction. I would speed up here. So basically, Teresa already touched upon those things, although granted in the framework of business and human rights, it's a little bit different when liability is concerned. But I would actually, because I also mentioned that we are in the middle of having a new instrument that's going to regulate this particular piece. We had this very interesting study that was presented by Professor Makokadeo, and it was concerning how different stakeholders see the best way of liability allocation and regulation in general when it comes to supply chain. And the results were pretty interesting, actually, because it shows the complete opposition between the way that industry and civil society sees as the most effective way to regulate and to also to distribute liability. So I would go to my conclusion. So I created my conclusion as actually an open question or questions. And it's regarding the role of liability in the future AI business and human rights framework. I touched upon this. Also the role of liability for human rights violation in Industry 4.0, which we are exploring at the moment, but also about this difference between contractual liability and tort liability in the business and human rights setting. And actually, I prepared this before hearing Teresa and her conclusions on the technological unit. And I think that this is very interesting point we should consider when we are looking how in the supply chain we distribute liability, and if it should also, because traditionally it is all about tort. So thank you, and I'm sorry that I abused my time.